A monk in the year 900 wrote 7 words in Latin that might be the most honest sentence of the entire medieval period. Translated, they read, "We do not know what comes next." He wasn't being dramatic. He wasn't writing poetry. He's recording the weather, the harvest, the raids, the deaths. And at the end of the entry, he added that line, "We do not know what comes next." We have not known for a long time. The next page of the manuscript is blank. Not because the monk died, the chronicle resumes months later in a different hand. But that gap, those blank pages between one writer and the next, tells you something about 900 AD England that no list of facts can. This was a country that had stopped being able to predict its own future. And it had been that way for 500 years. To understand 900 AD, the context matters. 5 centuries earlier, England was a Roman province, Britannia. It had roads, not paths, not tracks. Roads. Stone-paved, engineered, graded, drained, maintained highways that connected every major settlement in the country. It had aqueducts carrying fresh water into cities. It had heated bathhouses. It had a postal system. It had a professional army, a tax administration, a legal code written down and enforced by magistrates. And then, around 410 AD, Rome left. The legions withdrew. The administrators departed. The tax collectors stopped coming. And the infrastructure, all of it, every road, every aqueduct, every bathhouse, began to decay. Not overnight, slowly. A bridge that wasn't repaired after a flood. A road section that crumbled and nobody fixed. An aqueduct that cracked and carried less water each year until it carried none. The technology to build these things left with the people who understood it. What remained were the structures themselves, standing, visible, increasingly useless. Monuments to a capability that no longer existed. Picture this. You are standing on a perfectly straight road that runs for 100 miles in either direction. The stones under feet are cut with a precision that nobody in your village can replicate. The road has been there longer than anyone can remember. And you know, without anyone having to tell you, that when these stones finally crumble, nobody alive will be able to replace them. By 900 AD, those Roman roads were still there. People still walked on them. In some places, they were the best maintained surfaces in the country, not because anyone was maintaining them, but because Roman engineering was so robust that 5 centuries of neglect had not fully destroyed them. But the roads led to places that no longer existed in the same form. The Roman city of Londinium had contracted to a fraction of its former size. Bath, built around the Roman thermal springs, one of the finest bathing complexes in the Western Empire, was largely abandoned. Its great pool cracked and filling with rubble. A Saxon poet, looking at the ruins of a Roman city, probably Bath, wrote a poem that survives as The Ruin. The lines describe hot water flowing through stone channels, walls decorated with metal and glass, a city built for giants. The poet cannot understand how it was made. He knows only that the people who built it are gone, and the work is beyond anything his own civilization can produce. That poem is not nostalgia. It is bewilderment. He is standing inside the evidence of something that should not be possible, and he has no explanation for it. Here's the thing about the so-called Dark Ages that changes everything once it clicks. The darkness was not ignorance. The people of 900 AD England were not stupid. They were farmers, builders, metal workers, poets, priests, and warriors. They could forge iron, build ships that crossed the North Sea, compose epic poetry in a language of extraordinary complexity, and organize military defenses against one of the most effective raiding forces in European history. the Vikings. What they could not do was replicate Roman engineering. The knowledge was gone. Not hidden, not forbidden, gone. The concrete formula that allowed Romans to build structures that lasted millennia had vanished with the people who knew it. The surveying techniques that produced perfectly straight roads across hundreds of miles were lost. The hydraulic engineering that moved water uphill through aqueducts was a mystery. 900 AD, England was not dark because its people were primitive. It was dark because it existed in the shadow of a civilization whose achievements it could see, touch, walk on, but could not reproduce. That is a specific and haunting kind of darkness, not the absence of light. The presence of evidence that light once existed, and the inability to rekindle it. The daily reality of 900 AD was shaped by this absence. Take water. Under Rome, cities had engineered water supplies, aqueducts feeding public fountains, bathhouses, and private connections for the wealthy. By 900 AD, the water supply in most of England was whatever stream, spring, or well was nearest. There was no treatment. There was no system. If the nearest water source dried up or became contaminated, the settlement moved or suffered. Take roads. Under Rome, moving goods and people across England was fast and predictable. The road network connected London to York, to Chester, to Exeter, at consistent speeds. By 900, the roads still existed as physical objects, but the network they served had fragmented. Towns had shrunk. Trade had contracted. A journey that took 3 days under Rome now took a week, because the bridges were gone, and the only way across the river was to find a ford and hope the water was low enough. Take heating. A Roman villa had a hypocaust, an underfloor heating system that circulated warm air beneath stone floors. Sophisticated, effective, comfortable. By 900 AD, heating was a fire pit in the center of a one-room wooden building. The smoke filled the room and slowly escaped through the thatch. The difference between these two systems is not centuries. It is a different civilization operating on a different level of knowledge. And the people of 900 AD walked past the collapsed remains of Roman villas, sometimes built their own homes inside them, without understanding how the hypocaust beneath their feet had worked. Take law. Under Rome, if someone stole a man's property, the victim appealed to a magistrate who consulted a written legal code. By 900 AD, justice in most of England operated through a system of oaths and ordeal. If a person was accused of theft, the accused could gather oath helpers, men willing to swear to his character. If the oaths were insufficient, the case might go to trial by ordeal, holding a hot iron, plunging a hand into boiling water. If the burns healed cleanly within 3 days, God had judged you innocent. That was the legal system. It was not chaotic. It had rules, precedents, and community buy-in. But it was a system that had replaced written law with physical suffering, and rational inquiry with divine judgment. And the people who lived under it had no memory of anything different. Take medicine. Under Rome, military surgeons traveled with the legions, carrying surgical instruments and medical texts compiled over centuries. Roman medical knowledge was imperfect, deeply imperfect, but it existed as a systematic body of learning passed from practitioner to practitioner. By 900 AD, medical knowledge in England had contracted to the monastery and the local healer. Herbal remedies survived. Some of them worked. Many did not. The systematic approach, observation, treatment, record, had fragmented into folk practice. If you were injured in 900 AD, The treatment depended on which village you were in and what the local healer happened to know. There was no standard. There was no reference. There was whatever had been passed down and whatever had been lost along the way. And then there were the Vikings. From the late 8th century onward, Norse raiders struck the English coast with increasing frequency and force. Monasteries, which held the only concentrations of wealth and learning in the country, were primary targets. Lindisfarne, the great monastery off the Northumbrian coast, was raided in 793. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the attack with horror. Strange signs in the sky, followed by raiders who destroyed the church, killed the monks, and carried away everything of value. That raid was the beginning. Over the next century, the Norse presence in England shifted from raiding to settlement to conquest. By the late 9th century, roughly half of England, the Northeast, the Midlands, East Anglia, was under Scandinavian control. This territory was called the Danelaw. The border between Anglo-Saxon England and the Danelaw was not a wall. It was a negotiation. It moved. It held for a while, and then it didn't. And then someone fought a battle, and then it held somewhere else. Living near the border in 900 AD meant not knowing, on any given month, which laws applied to the land you were standing on. Imagine waking up in a village 10 miles from the Danelaw line. The man who collected your taxes last autumn was Saxon. The men who burned the farm 3 miles east last spring were Norse. The border had shifted twice in your lifetime. It would shift again. One man held what remained together, or at least tried to. Alfred, King of Wessex, who would later be called the Great, the only English monarch to receive that title. Alfred did not defeat the Vikings. He survived them. At his lowest point, in 878, he was hiding in the marshes of Somerset with a small band of followers. The King of England, living in a swamp. He rebuilt from there. He reorganized the military into a system of rotating service so that half the fighting men were always available, while the other half farmed. He built a network of fortified towns, burhs, positioned so that no point in Wessex was more than a day's march from a defensible position. He commissioned translations of Latin texts into English because he understood that if knowledge only existed in a language that most people could not read, it would disappear entirely. He was not a romantic figure. He was an administrator fighting entropy, trying to hold a system together when every force in the world was pulling it apart. And even Alfred, with everything he built, could not recreate what Rome had provided. He could organize defense. He could encourage learning. He could not build an aqueduct. The gap between what was needed and what was possible was the defining feature of his entire reign. So why do we call them the Dark Ages? The term itself comes later, Renaissance scholars looking back at the centuries between Rome and their own era and seeing a gap. A gap in learning, in art, in architecture, in written records. And they were partly right. The written record from this period is thin. The architectural record is modest. The artistic production, compared to Rome or the Renaissance, is limited. But the name implies that the people living in this period were somehow lesser, dimmer, more primitive, less capable. And that is wrong. They were working with what they had. What they had was dramatically less than what Rome had provided, and they knew it. The monk who wrote, "We do not know what comes next," was not confessing weakness. He was describing a condition. He lived in a world where the infrastructure was failing. The political boundaries were unstable. The knowledge base was shrinking. And the only certainty was that tomorrow was uncertain. Dark is the wrong word for that. Unpredictable is closer. Fragile is closer still. They were living in a civilization that could break at any point, and they knew it. And they kept going anyway. That is 900 AD England. Not a period of stupidity or barbarism. A period of fragility, where the evidence of a greater past was everywhere, the tools to rebuild it were nowhere, and the people who lived through it had no guarantee that things would get better. The monks wrote their chronicles not knowing whether anyone would read them. Alfred built his fortified towns not knowing whether they would hold. The farmers planted crops not knowing whether they would harvest them before the next raid. And that uncertainty, not the violence, not the poverty, not the disease, but the not knowing, was the defining experience of the age. The Romans had given England certainty, roads that would last, water that would flow, borders that would hold. 900 AD had none of those things, and the people who lived in it woke up every morning and did the work anyway. Not because they believed it would last, because the work was what they had. Cowboys had bad food and worse weather, but at least they knew where the trail ended. The people of 900 AD didn't even have that. But there's a place in medieval England, 300 years later, 1200s, where civilization had rebuilt enough to produce permanent homes. Permanent stone walls, permanent fireplaces. The problem is that every part of those homes was actively dangerous. The thatch, the fire, the floor, the air. Next time, a day inside a 1200s English home, and why the safest place in it was still trying to kill the people who lived there.